Welcome to Rights of a Free People, a television show brought to you by the ACLU of Rhode Island. Tonight we have a very exciting show for you because we're going to talk about the First Amendment. My name's Carolyn Mannis, and I am an attorney in private practice, and I'm also on both the national board and the local board of the ACLU. My guests this evening are Ed Fitzpatrick, and he works at Roger Williams. You can give you a full title.
I'm the Director of Media and Public Relations at Roger Williams University, and I'm on the New England First Amendment Coalition Board.
Very good. And we also have Linda Levin. She's a former professor. She's done it all. She's been inducted into the Hall of Fame. Tell us, and you're the president of the Access Rhode Island?
Access Rhode Island Coalition.
And what does that do?
We're a coalition of open government groups. Your ACLU is involved in it, is one of the members, Common Cause, and some others. And we're trying to keep government transparent in Rhode Island.
Well, that's an important...
It's a never-ending job.
So when we talk about the First Amendment, I know you said you have a class on the First Amendment.
Yeah, I just came from class down at Roger Williams. I teach a journalism class there. Juniors and seniors, they're really sharp.
And one of the things we learned about the First Amendment is there are actually 5 rights that it protects.
5 freedoms. And yeah, there was just a survey recently that we were just talking about that showed that a lot of people don't know, what is it, 37% of those in a recent survey didn't know any of the 5 freedoms, which is unfortunate. 48% knew freedom of speech is the one most people know, but when I was pretty depressed to learn that only like 13%, I think, knew freedom of the press.
And so, Linda, what are a couple of the other 5? We talked about speech and press.
Well, the one that's most pertinent today, other than press and speech, is the right to peacefully assemble. And I think that's such an important right when you want to protest.
And then we also have freedom of religion and freedom to petition your government for a redress of your grievances. Right. And as an attorney, that one is near and dear to my heart. Because if you don't have access to the courts, it can be, or access to your congressman, or access to a local agency to petition them, to ask them to help you, then the democracy can fail. So those are...
And that's the one the fewest people know, but it's so important.
Yes. And I think peacefully assemble is one that they're not terribly familiar with. Religion, a lot of people, I think, if you push them a little, would say a right to practice my own religion.
It's big at Roger Williams University, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
Separation of
you would know that.
Church and state. Yeah.
Because of Roger Williams, who was actually one of the first founders who left Massachusetts so that he wouldn't be persecuted for his religious beliefs, or lack of them, as it may be. So we have that. We talked about protest. Now, in a post-Trump election, we talk about the right to protest, and we've seen a number of protests. Some have been violent, some have been nonviolent. How do you see the First Amendment as it relates to, for example, Charlottesville?
That was a tough one. That was difficult. It was difficult because if you truly believe in the First Amendment, you realize that both of these groups had a right to protest. And I taught media law, First Amendment law at the University of Rhode Island for almost 30 years. And I used to tell the students, if you believe in the First Amendment, you're going to have to put up with some things that you may not like. And certainly some of the protesters, the anti-Semitic protesters who were protesting in favor of white supremacy and so forth, we may not agree with them, but if they peacefully protest, there's not a problem. They have a right to do that. It's when they start hurting people.
Yeah, I think moments like this are a real test of our commitment to those 5 freedoms, because to see neo-Nazis and Klan members and white supremacists with tiki torches marching through the quad there at the University of Virginia was very disturbing. Like the dean the former dean of the law school at Roger Williams, David Logan, said he went to University of Virginia, and it reminded him of, it was like being in Germany in 1938, see that kind of imagery. So it's where theory meets. These are the real times that test our commitment to that. But way back I think it was in 1917, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a famous dissent talking about freedom for the speech we hate. And when it's something we all agree on and we can all come together, it doesn't really test that commitment. But when it's something that is hateful and stupid as what those people were saying, then it really does. And a lot of European countries don't allow the extent of, Germany doesn't allow you to use swastikas and to deny the Holocaust, and Ireland doesn't have that much freedom for this kind of speech, this kind of hate speech. We do, but you do pay a price for it, because the targeted groups certainly feel threatened, and it's tough to see.
It is, and it's hard to know beforehand if it's going to become violent.
Right.
It's easy in hindsight to say, well, shouldn't have been allowed because of the outcome.
Yeah.
But to know beforehand that it's not going to be peaceful is not known, even if you know the speech is going to be abhorrent. And I would just say, and I know the ACLU in Virginia supported the rights of the neo-Nazis to their free speech. However, we also do not support their positions. No. And that's very clear, that we believe in racial justice.
That's a conundrum.
That's the other part of it, is you definitely allow that kind of freedom even when it's difficult, but then speak up and tell them why they're wrong and condemn it. And Boston did it a little better, I thought, where there was that up in Boston Common where it avoided the violence we saw down in Charlottesville. It separated the two groups. You can have restrictions on time and place and manner of free speech. The one thing I think they should have done differently in Boston is they didn't let the media cover what the people were saying in the middle of all the protests, the counter-protests. So I think that should have been allowed. So there's freedom of speech on both sides. Right,
and I think the classic story is if you don't defend the rights of abhorrent speech, who's going to be there to defend your right to speak when you're trying to make a point? And if you silence the abhorrent speech, it pushes it further underground, and it lets us believe that it doesn't exist. So in this particular case, there was tragedy, which was undeniable. But in some ways, there are lessons that we learn from things like Charlottesville, in that look at the number of neo-Nazis we have in our country. And if they didn't have the right to protest, and we didn't defend that right, we could believe that there are only a handful of people holding those views.
That's another way of looking at it.
So it is, in my opinion, although very distasteful, to have to defend them in any sense because of their abhorrent views. It is a necessary evil in order to live in a free society. And I think there's an obligation for leaders when that kind of aberrant speech is out there to condemn it in unqualified way. And the president did not do that. This kind of false. People are wrong on both sides, instead of just condemning it and calling it what it was, and not equivocating. Like, if any time there was time for a leader to condemn in strong terms, I think that was it. I would totally agree, and I'm sure Linda agrees as well.
Yes.
Speaking of the president, he's been known to take to a Twitter storm or two and tweet and retweet things, which is also obviously his First Amendment right, but it raises issues with fake news.
Well, it certainly does that. I think that he's the first president who has used technology in that way. Obama enjoyed using technology, but he was mostly glued to his phone, his cell phone. And I think that this is I've taught classes on presidential politics and on presidents in the media, and watching the way Trump has handled getting his message out is completely unlike any president in the history of this country, and certainly any late 20th century president. They've all used the mass media of television, first radio with Franklin Roosevelt, and then radio and television with Eisenhower and on, and then the newspapers and press conferences and so forth. And to have a president who is bypassing all of the mass media that we've traditionally known as mass media and going to the internet and using Twitter to get his message out, where no one can ask him to explain something or to clarify something. And he has to do it in what, 78 characters, or what is Twitter?
140.
140. Yeah. Oh, I was only half off. So that there's no explanation of anything. It just goes out as a statement, and no one can question it.
It is a different time.
It is. But fake news, I think, is, to me, fake news is InfoWars questioning whether 9/11 was real, or Sandy Hook really happened, or whether there's a sex ring out of a pizza place in D.C.
Oh, right,
like
that was a terrible story.
That's fake news. The president's tried to hijack the phrase to call it fake news when any media outlet publishes or airs something that is critical of him or he disagrees with. It's like fake news is a different animal.
But hasn't he also been accused of retweeting things that were fake news?
Yes, yes,
so
absolutely.
That's what my reference was to.
type of things, yeah. Just nonsense.
And fake news can really harm a community. I was reading a story out of Idaho, where one of the smaller cities in Idaho, I think the population was about 48,000, has been ripped apart by a fake news story that said some children who were Syrian immigrants had raped some local children. And in fact, there were no Syrian immigrants in this city. And it just was, Breitbart went after the story and blew it up, and it just became a story full of fake information. And people in the community believed it. Many of them did, and many of them said, no, we know the real story. And it's just torn that community to shreds.
It can be quite harmful. I know.
Yes.
I'm like the self-appointed police on my Facebook. And when my friends, even people who I agree with, maybe perhaps politically or socially, post things. Like recently I saw something on one of my friends in my news feed about how Melania Trump had stolen another speech of Michelle Obama when she spoke at the UN, and it just wasn't true. Yeah. And I said, you should take this down. There's just so much out there that you can criticize about. You shouldn't need to resort to the
on both
the fake
ends of
news.
the spectrum. There's enough to deal with that's true. You don't have to deal with the fake news. Yeah.
Ed's a lot younger than I am, but he grew up as I did in newspapers. And we firmly understand and believe in good journalism. And one of the things that's happened with the internet is that anybody can publish on the internet. And so you get more fake news. I mean, at one time, William Randolph Hearst, many, many decades ago, ran the occasional fake, or maybe more than occasional, fake news story in his newspapers. But it was in print. You could read it, and you could argue about it, and you could go to another newspaper and read maybe the real story. But there is so much out there now that it's, if I didn't know anything about journalism, I think I would find it very frustrating to be a consumer of news today.
Yeah, just having some media literacy, I think, is much more difficult these days. It's not just 3 networks and the local paper
And the
national
PBS.
and PBS. It's a lot. It's a lot more fractured, and you've got to be a lot more thoughtful about what you're posting on Facebook and whether it comes from a reliable news source.
And what advice would you give to our viewers regarding how to think critically about the news that they receive and how to discern real news from fake news?
Education. And it starts in the 1st grade probably, or before. And if children are educated to understand what news is, and if their parents are reading news and talking about it and having intelligent discussions about it, I think you're going to have a society that is not just more informed, but more curious about and careful about what they read and perceive as news.
And how about when you translate into the social media?
Yeah, I don't retweet stuff that unless you know it's true, unless it comes from a reliable news source, because then it just becomes viral and it, be sure it's firmly planted on fact.
I recall not too long ago there was something I had seen regarding what news sources are more reliable and more factual.
Yeah.
And obviously the ones that are more mainstream tend, because they are checked more often, tend to be those that you can rely on more.
Except that, of course, there are the conservatives who believe that those news outlets are controlled by liberals, liberal businesses and liberal owners. I just want to point out that I love the Washington Post, and I probably love it even more now, and I try to read it every day along with the New York Times, and the Providence Journal. But the Washington Post has no doubt taken a very liberal viewpoint on politics in Washington. And if they can find a way to make the president look bad, and I truly, I see this every day on the website, that will be a major story. And I'm beginning to understand more and more why some of my conservative friends don't trust the news media, because they look at these big major institutions like the Washington Post, say, but they obviously are liberal, and they don't care about me.
And you're talking about the news stories in the Washington Post?
Oh, yes. The commentary is very definitely slanted toward the left, but even the news stories, a lot of them, or at least the headlines.
Because, that's part of being media literacy is being able to distinguish between opinion, columnists, and editorials and the news content. But I think that's true more so than when we started out in the industry, is that the media is more partisan, and you should be aware of that too. Whether you're reading a very conservative outlet or a very liberal outlet, you can get a different take on the world as we know it. But I do think, like, the Post and the Times and the Wall Street Journal have done some very good work on accountability, holding government accountable.
They have, definitely. But I think that the Post in particular made a decision, Marty Barron, the editor, made a decision sometime before Trump was elected, while he was running for president, that they were going to make sure that they covered everything they could about him. And it's true, but it's oftentimes maybe overblown is the word I want, or made more important than it might normally be.
Or it's always like a pejorative. It's never a neutral, because it seems to me like I did take some journalism classes in the early days of my college at Rhode Island College, and I remember it was supposed to be like just the facts, the who, what, where, why, how. And we don't see that as much these days. It doesn't grab the headlines. It doesn't make you turn the TV on, or it doesn't make you read the newspaper if it's too neutral, and especially when there are so many options out there.
But I think there's a great need now for real solid watchdog journalism and just getting the facts out, because there are so many partisan outlets and there's so much secrecy, and as you said, the politicians go over the media's head to social media. You know, I don't think there's ever been a time when we needed real solid, tenacious journalism more than we do now.
And this is the time that newspapers in particular are laying off more and more people in their newsrooms.
It is a sad thing to watch. The media is so important. You had mentioned about Dean Logan saying about how the spectacle of University of Virginia reminded him of the Nazi events that transpired. It seems to me that when you think about losing media and shutting down the media and having the government control media, the propaganda.
Oh, do we need that fourth estate out there more than ever?
Absolutely.
It's also very reminiscent of what you heard about reported from like World War II.
Yeah, and you know, there's all the fact-checking organizations to see if what politicians say is true. Like that's needed more than ever, because there's so much spin, there's so much emphasis placed on getting the politicians' propaganda out. You know, you've got to, you need to check what's true and tell people, and that gets attacked. You know, the partisan forces on both sides will say, well, that fact-checking is all skewed, but you know, I think they serve a vital role in this time.
Yeah, and the position has always been that you counter bad speech or wrong speech with more speech.
Exactly. And
proper speech and correct speech. And
the marketplace, that's
of ideas.
Holmes' marketplace of ideas, that you hope good speech, smarter speech, and
is that Justice Brennan that came up with that marketplace of ideas? I think it was in the Times v. Sullivan case. And I always remember marketplace of ideas.
I think it went back to Holmes's dissent and first, but it probably came up later, sure.
Yeah.
It is interesting to think that we live in a society, and almost seems like it's circling back around, where we used to have, you know, the yellow journalism. And then it wasn't until we worked that out with freedom of speech and then libel laws and stuff like that. And now it seems like we've come full circle. Now we have this social media that is just unwielding at this point.
And I think one takeaway for the viewers is you've got to support good journalism with your money. You know, I mean, it's not going to be free. You get what you pay for. You know, there's lots of people with opinions or tweets that aren't worth anything. But you need to, someone needs to pay for those reporters to go down to City Hall and Town Hall and the courthouse and find out what's going on and report the facts. So you've got to support your local newspaper, your local TV stations and radio stations, and make sure those reporters are out there.
But I'm not sure that people will, because they get this so-called free news on the internet. Once newspapers started putting their news, and TV stations too have their websites, once they started putting this for free on the internet, it's really hard to take it back. It's hard to turn around and say, you can't read this anymore unless you pay.
Yeah, the business model's tough, but you do see the New York Times and the Washington Post getting a big boost in the number of people reading them.
They're such major, important news organizations.
Yeah, there's very few.
And there aren't. Even the Chicago Tribune, which is now owned by a company called Tronc, I'm not even sure that they are doing great journalism anymore. I have to admit, I haven't read the Trib in a while. But there are fewer and fewer of those seriously intelligent, neutral, if you will, voices out there in the marketplace today that are legitimate news sources.
And then you also have your watchdog programs like Access Rhode Island that help get access to information when either the government isn't providing it. That's another check, so to speak, on
Well,
on
that
the
was why we
government.
founded it, because we were finding that journalists in the state, this was the Rhode Island Press Association, a man named Tom Heslin, and I decided that we had just listened to enough reporters from around Rhode Island in the Journal talking about how they could not get access, particularly to police information that should have been open to the public, and that's how we went out and found like-minded organizations, if you will, to join up, and we formed Access Rhode Island. And it's funny, it's been in existence about 20 years now. No, 30 years. And, no, 1998. And every time I think that we've moved ahead and that we've finally gotten people to understand that you've got to have transparency in government, something happens and we drop back about 10 steps. And you certainly found this as a working journalist.
Yeah, that still is relevant today, and it's great that you and Tom started Access Rhode Island and Common Cause Rhode Island. I'm on the board there. They just recently were taking up that fight for the police logs out in Black Island.
Yeah, that was John Marion and I decided we ought to.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
That was an Access.
So yeah, it's just the day-to-day getting the information about the police logs on Black Island.
We got them.
Still a
Very interesting read of what goes on Block Island.
Yeah, lots of problems with scooters, I understand. Motorized scooters.
And drunk people sleeping behind bars on the ground. And
Oh, really?
yeah,
I know in the East Bay they publish the Barrington police log, and my husband and I, every time it comes in, we fight over who gets to read it out loud, and inevitably there's always 2 bikes that are lost and then 2 bikes that are found in the same blog. So
police logs are
good.
really important to be published, and a lot of papers have stopped publishing them, including the Journal. And the reason is that this is how you know what's going on in your neighborhood. And you want to know if the bikes have been stolen, because maybe your child has a bike that they park out next to the garage at night, and you say, take your bike in and put it inside the garage. I think that those are little pieces of daily living that are kind of being ignored in a lot of news media today, that ought to be published. And the more you publish of those things, the more they're going to remain open to the public.
It's a fascinating. We could talk about this all night.
Oh, yes.
We could on, and I'm curious to see if we get access to the visitors logs at Mar-a-Lago, which has been
yes.
one of the
Yes.
more recent things. And again, it tells you something about your government if you know who the President of the United States is keeping company with.
And that's the Washington Post going after it,
Yes,
I believe.
yes, yeah, it is.
And
Good example of watchdog journalism.
It's an important role, and we will obviously do our bit to fight to keep
Well, I hope they
government.
get the logs. This is another reason we need them.
Well, I want to thank my guests tonight, Ed Fitzpatrick
Thanks for having me on.
and Linda Levin. I hope you'll come back again. We maybe can speak more about the First Amendment. And
Absolutely.
I'm sure there's going to be a lot that comes up in the next few years of the Trump presidency.
Next few days.
Yes.
Probably. I want to encourage my viewers, if they have any questions or want to contact the ACLU, the name and number should be on the screen even as I'm speaking. Again, my name is Carolyn Mannis, and thank you for watching Rights of a Free People.
Cut.